Good afternoon. My name is Austen Parrish. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome you to the annual Harris Lecture at the Law School, and part of our Brown at 60 series, a film series and a speaker series that commemorates the 60th anniversary of the landmark decision Brown versus Board of Education. Before we begin, I first wanted to thank formally the Office of the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Multicultural Affairs. This program would not be possible without their support. They put on tremendous programming throughout the university, and we're so grateful that they are helping us putting on this particular series. I also wanted to thank the large number of students and faculty and staff, who I will not mention individually, who have helped put in a tremendous amount of time to make this series possible in this particular program. And I also have been asked to note that the Harris Lecture today will be available online via live streaming, and will be going sent to all the regional IU campuses, so not just here, and you can see it online later on. Let me give you a little bit of background about the Harris Lecture. The Harris Lecture was established in 1946 as one of our earliest endowed lectures and one of the most prestigious, and it's named after Edison Harris, who was born in 1840. He was a distinguished Indiana lawyer and a statesman, a member of the State Senate, appointed by President McKinley as a minister to Austria-Hungary. He grew up in Indiana and was one of the state's most well-known lawyers during the 1800s. After his diplomatic post, he returned to Indiana, served as president of our law school, the president to the University of Indianapolis, the Indiana Bar Association, and Purdue University's Board of Trustees. Past lectures have included some of the most distinguished professors and leaders in law and business, including people like Judith Resnick, Pam Carlin, Elizabeth Warren, Cass Susteen, Guido Calabrese, and Derek Bell. Today, it is a tremendous honor to continue that long tradition of welcoming tremendous leaders and lawyers to the law school, and welcome Julian Bond as the 2014 Harris Lecture. Yeah, I think that's right. Professor Julian Bond is simply a giant in the American civil rights movement. He was the first president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. He has been the board chairman of the NAACP and its chairman emeritus. He was the founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the most important organizations of the American civil rights movement in the 1960s. He's also made a major difference in politics. He served 4 terms in the Georgia House of Representatives and then 6 terms in the state Senate, serving in the legislature for more than 20 years. He has been on faculty of several of the nation's most prestigious universities, including Harvard, Pennsylvania, American, and the University of Virginia. He has received through his life, and we stopped counting, but more than 25 honorary degrees, and has a number of books written about him, his leadership, and his tremendous role in advancing civil rights in the United States. I wanted to mention that he narrated the critically acclaimed PBS series, Eyes on the Prize. And the reason why I emphasize that is because episodes of the documentary are going to be shown tomorrow night at the IU Cinema starting at 7 p.m. and is being sponsored by our own American Constitution Society. So I hope you'll join us there if you can. I'm not doing justice to the depth of the contribution that Mr. Bond has made to American society and the civil rights movement, but I hope you'll join me right now with another round of applause to welcome Julian Bond as he does his lecture.
Thank you a great deal for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this warm welcome. This is, I believe, the 3rd time I've spoken here. The first time many, many years ago, and to my great surprise, ran into a classmate of mine when I spoke here. What was his name? Leroy Keith, who later became president of Morehouse College. Does that name ring a bell to you? Yeah. And then my wife, who's an attorney, Pamela Harwitz, and I spent a portion of our honeymoon here at the Student Union in the bridal suite. And we were thrilled to learn that there was a bridal suite at the Union, and that we were told this was the biggest student union in the country. So that was a big thrill for us. And I have to say something I'm not really proud of. At that time, I was enamored of Bobby Knight. And I thought if I'd walk around Bloomington, there he is. I'd run into him. It did not happen. It did not happen. But anyway, it's a great, great pleasure to be here, and particularly here to see my former student and TA, Tim Lovelace. I take credit for all of his success. It's always good to see him. But let me begin. On May 17th of 1954, speaking for a unanimous Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, Chief Justice Earl Warren said, "Today, education is the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for public education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Today it is the principal instrument of awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him adjust normally to his environment. In these days, it's doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity for an education. Such an opportunity, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right which must be available to all on equal terms." He wrote those words in response to the brief found by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. They made this argument. They said, "These infant appellants are asserting the most important secular claims that can be put forward by children, the claim to learn and grow, and the inescapably connected but even more important claim to be treated as entire citizens of the society in which they have been born." 2 months later, on July 17, 1954, construction began at Disneyland. Sadly, today Brown's promise is still lost in Fantasyland. The Magic Kingdom remains closed to children of color in America. I want to talk about the Brown decision and its present legacy. I want to place that discussion in the context of my family's history while I trace the history of Brown. I believe in an integrated America, integrated schools, jobs, and homes. I believe it enough to have spent most of my life in its elusive pursuit. I think it a legal, moral, and political imperative for America, a matter of elemental justice, simple right waged against simple wrong. My grandfather, James Bond, belonged to a transcendent generation of black Americans, born into slavery, freed by the Civil War, determined to make their way as free women and men. From Berea College, he studied for the ministry, married, and had 6 children, one of them my father, Horace Mann Bond. My father graduated from Pennsylvania's Lincoln University and won a doctorate in education from the University of Chicago. For him, too, education was a means up to a larger end, the uplift of his people and the salvation of his race. How fitting, then, that he would be asked to help the NAACP in its legal campaign against school segregation, the campaign that culminated in Brown v. Board of Education. There can be no mistake. The years since Brown have seen the fortunes of black Americans advance and retreat, but the decision is always a cause for sober celebration, not impotent dismay. We celebrate the brilliant legal minds who were the architects of Brown. We celebrate the brave families who were its plaintiffs, and we celebrate the legal principle that remains its enduring legacy, that in the words of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. If it took the Depression in 1929 to convince America it was obligated to protect each citizen's well-being, the Supreme Court decision of '54 began to convince reluctant white Americans they'd have to share their knowledge, their bounty, and their world. As the writer Richard Kluger wrote, not until the Supreme Court acted in 1954 did the nation acknowledge it had been blaming the black man for what it had done to him. His sentence to second-class citizenship had been commuted. The quest for meaningful equality, equality in fact as well as in law, had begun. It's easy now to cast a cynical eye on the status of school desegregation in America today, or the sorry state of race relations, and to minimize the significance of Brown. That's a grave mistake. For Brown, by destroying segregation's legality, gave a nonviolent army the license and power to attack and destroy its morality as well. But Brown did more than that. In 1930, the Margold Report, commissioned by the NAACP to chart the direction the civil rights organization ought to take in the courts, suggested boldly challenging the constitutional validity of segregation, and predicted the legal effort itself would stir the spirit of revolt among blacks. Brown did just that. In its aftermath, the Black South was emboldened and soon exploded in protest, and the decision's annual anniversary quickly became a celebratory signpost for the growing movement for civil rights. Martin Luther King's first national address was at a prayer pilgrimage on the third anniversary of Brown at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. in 1957. I was one of several thousand Atlanta sit-in students in a march on the Georgia State Capitol to commemorate the 1960 anniversary of Brown. The freedom rides through the South were timed to conclude in New Orleans at Brown's 7th anniversary in 1961. That the quest for meaningful equality, political as well as economic equity, remains unfulfilled today, that's no indictment of past efforts. Instead, it's a testament to the challenges that lie ahead. Today, this slave's grandson is a professor emeritus at the university founded by slave master Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, having taught young black and white Americans about the modern-day struggle for human liberty. My students learned about a more modern, transcendent generation than my grandfather's. They studied a generation born in segregation in the 20th century, freed from racism restraints through their own efforts, determined to make their way as free women and men. This generation shares confidence with the slave-born generation which preceded and produced it. Speaking in 1901, my grandfather viewed the world before him hopefully. He said then, "The false partitions set up to separate the races and classes are falling down. Illogical and unchristian distinctions, though still disgracing the age and hampering the spirit of progress, must soon yield to justice and right, then forward in the struggle for advancement. Wrong for a time may seem to prevail, and the good already accomplished seem to be overthrown, but forward in the struggle, inspired by the achievements of the past, sustained by a faith that knows no faltering, forward in the struggle." Today's students are confused, as are many of their elders, about what the civil rights movement's aims and goals were, what it accomplished, where it failed, and what their responsibilities are to complete its unfinished business today. What and how civil rights is taught reflects a great change in historiography, a rethinking of by whom and for whom the movement was made. Looking back at that movement from today, we now see a different view of the events and personalities of the period. Instead of the towering figures of Kennedys and Kings standing alone, we now see an army of anonymous women and men. Instead of famous orations made to multitudes, we now see the planning and the work that preceded the triumphant speech. And instead of a series of well-publicized marches and protests, we now see long organizing campaigns and brave and lonely soldiers often working in near solitude. And instead of prayerful petitions for government's deliverance, we now see aggressive demands for equal citizenship and the prevailing ethic of self-help. We now realize our view of the movement's goals was narrow too. In addition to integrated classes, that movement wanted teachers in classrooms, principals in the school office, and presidents on the Board of Education. And instead of a movement that began with Brown in 1954 and went on to Montgomery in 1955, we now see a long and unceasing history of aggressive challenges to white supremacy that began as long ago as slavery time. That history is a never-ending struggle between wrong and right. The movement whose story that history tells has long followed, in general outline, a plan articulated when the 20th century was new, a plan which still fits our circumstances almost exactly today. In 1905, the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois proposed, "We must complain. Yes, plain, blunt complaint. Ceaseless agitation, unfailing exposure of dishonesty and wrong. This is the ancient, unerring way to liberty, and we must follow it." Next, he said, "We propose to work. These are the things that we as black men must try to do. We must press the matter of stopping the curtailment of our political rights. We must urge Negroes to vote honestly and effectively. We must push the matter of civil rights. We must organize business cooperation. We must build schoolhouses and increase the interest in education. We must bring Negroes and labor unions into mutual understanding. We must study Negro history. We must attack crime among us. To do all in our power, by word and by deed, to increase the efficiency of our race, the enjoyment of its manhood rights, the performance of its just duties. Building schoolhouses and increasing the interest in education fit easily into Du Bois's plan for black America. Like his contemporaries, he understood the importance of education. From slavery until now, black Americans have placed their faith in education, a faith well documented in my father's work. Describing the period after emancipation, he wrote, "At no time or place in history had there been exemplified so pathetic a faith in education as the lever of racial progress. Grown men studied their alphabets in the field, holding the blue-black scholar in one hand while they guided the plow with the other. Mothers tramped scores of miles to towns where they could place their children in school. Pine torches illuminated the dirt-floored cabins where men, women, and children studied until far into the night. No mass movement has been before in the American tradition than the urge which drove Negroes toward education soon after the Civil War. When my father was asked to contribute to the NAACP's brief in Brown v. Board of Education, he pursued this task with the optimism exhibited by his father many years before. When Brown came before the Supreme Court, both its presenters and the justices who heard it understood clearly the historic potential. In an unusual but not unheard of procedure, the case, actually 5 cases combined from Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, the District of Columbia, and Delaware, was argued first in the 1952 term and re-argued the next. Among other issues, the court struggled with the meaning of the 14th Amendment, that portion of the Constitution adopted after the Civil War, guaranteeing equal protection of the laws as well as due process. In scheduling Brown for re-argument, the court asked the lawyers to prepare written responses to 5 questions, 2 of them dealing with the history of the 14th Amendment and public education. The lawyers turned to the historians and constitutional experts, including my father, for assistance. While C. Van Woodward and John Hope Franklin were studying the post-Reconstruction policies regarding race relations in the South, and while Alfred Kelly and Howard J. Graham were working on the intent of the framers of the 14th Amendment, my father was researching the intentions of the ratifying states with respect to school segregation. Some scholars, like Henry Steele Comminger, declined to help the NAACP in this work. They believed the facts would not support the NAACP's position. My father knew, however, that the historical record need not be sacrificed for political goals. He pursued both without sacrificing either. In the end, the court regarded the historical evidence as inconclusive and a draw, which may have meant victory for the NAACP. It may have allowed the court to overcome Plessy's flat statement that Congress condoned segregation. Free to look for guidance elsewhere, the court was able to speak for what one historian called the American conscience. Perhaps having done the right thing by denouncing separate but equal, the court then felt free to delay the implementation of what it had announced. Whatever the reason, the phrase "with all deliberate speed" was added to the lexicon of ignominious judicial pronouncements less than a year after one of the most shameful judicial doctrines had been discarded. The court, a year after announcing its decision on the merits, ordered the nation to make haste slowly in disintegrating the system of separate but unequal schools. The defendants were required, in a masterpiece of ambiguity, to admit to public schools on a racially non-discriminatory basis with all deliberate speed the parties in these cases. For the first time, the court declared a right and then delayed its enjoyment. For the first 10 years after 1954, the emphasis was more on deliberate than on speed. The focus was on dismantling the dual school systems of the South, the projects of de jure segregation, and in Southern accents, all deliberate speed meant any conceivable delay. Actual integration was more a legal fiction than fact. President Dwight Eisenhower had lobbied Chief Justice Warren to rule that the Southern states and segregated schools. He never endorsed the Brown decision, and the resistant white South, emboldened by his rectitude, reacted with evasion and delay. Their tactics included violence, expansion of private schools, state support for fleeing white students, proposals to abolish public education, repeal of compulsory attendance laws, and the long-discarded theories of interposition and nullification. Prince Edward County, Virginia, simply closed its public schools for 5 years, believing that uneducated children were preferable to integrated ones. There were costs, too. In North Carolina, from 1963 to 1970, the number of black elementary school principals dropped from 620 to 170. Secondary school principals went from 209 to 10. By 1963, only 3 were left. And by 1972, 3,051 black North Carolina school teachers, 1/5 of all the state's black school teachers, had lost their jobs as black and white schools merged. Lost, too, was history, revered school names, mottos, mascots, traditions, plaques, trophy cases, school colors. All the artifacts that honored black achievement disappeared. Black students found themselves in formerly all-white school buildings that retained the character of identity acquired in the segregated past. Booker T. Washington High School vanished. Robert E. Lee High School persevered. By the end of 1964, 10 years after Brown, more than 97% of all Southern black school children still attended segregated schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination wherever federal funds were spent. And for the first time, under a Southern president, Lyndon Johnson, the federal government began to take an active role. This period saw the percentage of black children in school with white ones rise from 3 to 13%. Those 4 years, from 1964 to 1968, represent the only period since Brown in which there was active positive support from both the courts and the executive branch. Let me repeat. Since Brown was decided 60 years ago, there have only been 4 years when the courts and the executive branch actively supported its implementation, and those 4 years ended 46 years ago. So don't let anybody tell you that Brown is responsible for the sorry state of public education today. Had it been allowed to work, Brown could have elevated education and much more for millions of minority students across the country. Indeed, even as it fought headwinds, the desegregation process, especially for Southern blacks, was very substantial from the mid-1960s to the late 1980s. In the 10 years following the '64 Act, the Department of Justice brought legal actions against more than 500 school districts, and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare filed more than 600 complaints. It would be a full 13 years after Brown before the court, in the Green decisions, declared separate but equal dead and required school districts to produce plans which promised realistically to work and promised to work now. But in 1968, with the election to the White House of a candidate, Richard Nixon, resurrected from political death, a slumbering and sullen America, resentful of civil rights demands, gained a platform and a voice. An effort began, halting and disorganized at first, but in solid lockstep now, to roll back the gains made by minorities in the past. They cut back on school integration, on federal aid to education, on the pathetically small programs begun to make war on economic inequality. They changed the courageous Earl Warren Court that gave us Brown in 1954 to the cautious Warren Burger claque that gave us Bakke in 1978. The last major Supreme Court decision expanding school desegregation was almost 40 years ago in 1973. The present court has proved itself no friend to minorities, most infamously in the June 2013 decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Since the 1990s, the court fundamentally has worsened desegregation law. As desegregation plans have been terminated in many large school districts, segregation predictably has increased substantially. Many think it's just a matter of time before the court declares itself color blind to what it means to be the wrong color in America. But the worst damage was done when the victim was made responsible for the crime, and the national government began a hasty and undignified retreat from its role as protector of the poor. The burden of racial problem solving shifted from racism's creators to its victims. Black behavior, not white racism, became the reason why blacks and whites lived in separate worlds. Racism retreated and pathology advanced. In a kind of nonsensical tautology, we heard again and again, those people are poor because they're pathological because they are poor. As the focus shifted away from de jure segregation in the South toward de facto segregation in the North, the tactics of evasion and delay were given new life. In President Nixon's rhetoric, the familiar yellow school bus became a menacing machine, mowing down an American shrine, the neighborhood school. In President Lyndon Johnson's last year in office, the federal government reviewed 28 communities for compliance with desegregation guidelines. In Nixon's first year, the figure dropped to 16. By the second year, it stood at 15. By the third year, at 11. By the fourth year, 9. The first year of his second term, 1. And by the next year, the number dropped to none. The Alexander decision in 1969 ordered integration now. By the early 1990s, a court shaped by President Ronald Reagan gave permission to school districts to dismantle desegregation plans despite remaining vestiges of de jure segregation. Brown may be 60 years old, but it was only for a period of about 20 years that any school systems were under an immediate mandate to remove segregation root and branch. It's hardly a surprise then that when the current state of school integration is examined, discouraging results abound. While it's not true, as many claim, that the South is more segregated now than it was before Brown, it has lost all of the additional progress made in 1967. Even at that, it's still the least segregated region for black students, which tells you something about the country. Segregation has increased the most for Latinos. In the West, where there's been substantial integration in the 1960s, segregation has soared. The suburbs of the country's largest metropolitan areas are now half non-white, and there Latinos are significantly more segregated than blacks. As you might expect, segregation is severe in central cities of all sizes and worse in the central cities of the largest metro areas. Nationally, the typical white student is now in a school which is 3/4 white, 1/8 Latino, and 1/12 black. The typical black or Latino student in a class of 30 would have at least 20 black or Latino classmates and only 8 white ones. There are few matters on which experts on any given field agree. Educational experts, however, agree that no school district in America has managed to create equal education on a large scale in segregated schools, be they black or Hispanic schools. That's not to say there are no successful segregated schools. There are, particularly at the elementary level. But the bottom line is that students who attend schools that are segregated by race and income consistently rank lower in education achievement, especially at the secondary school level. In short, the United States cannot afford separate schools. The educational damage done by racial segregation doesn't grow from the relationship between blacks and whites alone. It grows from the relationship between blacks and whites and green. In America, the education dollar follows the white child. The students who are most likely to find themselves in schools of concentrated poverty today are not white. They are black and Latino. Compared with poor whites, poor blacks are more likely to live in neighborhoods where a high percentage of the residents are poor. They interact mainly with others who are poor, who share their disadvantage. They live squeezed together in less than standard housing, in neighborhoods denuded of essential services. They shop at stores owned by merchants geared to do business with a poor clientele. Their neighborhoods are economically and racially segregated, bereft of opportunity, out of sight, and out of mind. Their children attend schools with only other poor children. As the New Jersey Supreme Court said, they face, through no fault of their own, a life of poverty and isolation that most of us cannot begin to understand and appreciate. Fewer dollars in the parents' pockets mean fewer dollars in the school board's treasury. Children in high-poverty schools read less, get lower grades, and miss more days of school. Conversely, studies have shown that desegregated settings are associated with heightened academic achievement for minority students. Graduation rates, earnings, and physical well-being all increase, and these benefits extend across generations. Indeed, a mounting body of evidence indicates that desegregated schools are linked to profound benefits for all children. These settings foster critical thinking skills, heighten communication abilities, and friendships across racial lines. Economic and racial integration are preconditions for equal opportunity. Once achieved, they permanently alter the pattern of minority-majority relationships. In schools where racial integration exists, it's not only the most visible form of desegregation, but the only one that impacts personally on the lives of millions of whites. This is why whites have so strongly resisted it. It's also why blacks and other minorities must continue to insist upon them. I recently heard Minnie Jean Brown reflect on her experiences as one of the heroic Little Rock Nine who integrated Central High School in 1957. Someone asked her why she kept coming back to school day after day, despite daily harassment and intimidation that would have driven most people away. From the ferocity of her enemies, she said, "I knew there was something precious inside that school, and I was more determined to get it than they were to keep it from her grasp." There are those who scoff at Brown as if the advantages to black children were to be gained simply by sitting next to white ones in a classroom, as if some kind of skin-to-skin transfer of knowledge and education could occur. These critics miss the point of integrated schools. One writer called it radical. A public education system that is truly integrated and treats minorities and whites equally is the antithesis of the larger society, which is profoundly segregated and unequal. The goal of putting minorities and whites in the same classroom does not only equalize education, but also changes the formative racial experiences of the next generation. Our future as a nation depends on our willingness to continue to reach into the racial cleavage that defines American society and change the racial contours of our world. In 1954, the federal government's brief in Brown argued that school desegregation was a Cold War imperative, a necessary weapon to win America's battles overseas. Current events give us the same imperative, to prove to enemy and ally alike that our commitment to justice is sincere. Again, my grandfather's words speak to us. He said, "The pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded by all that is good or hopeful in the condition and the progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm, in every flash of lightning an omen of evil, and in every shadow that falls across his path a lurking foe. But he forgets that the clouds also bring life and hope, that the lightning purifies the atmosphere, that shadow and darkness prepare for sunshine and growth, and that hardships and adversity nerve the race as the individual for greater efforts and grander victories." Greater efforts and grander victories. That was the promise made by the generation born in slavery 150 years ago. That was the promise made by the generation that won the Great World War for democracy 7 decades ago. That was the promise made by the generation that brought democracy to America's darkest corners 5 decades ago, and that is the promise we must all seek to honor today. Thank you. Thank you. Now it's time for the question and answer period, which if you will ask the questions, I will give the answers. So are there, yes ma'am.
In the late 50s, I was living in Prince Edward County, Virginia. And I have to say that my husband and I and a number of other people, along with college, did fight back a little bit, but it was going on. And there were Quakers who came to town and tried to start schools for the children. And of course, as you know, they closed the public schools to avoid integration. And the whites were going to school in church basements. There was something wrong with that picture, you know. And so we did try our best, but of course it wasn't enough.
No, it wasn't enough. And, but you know, many of those children from Prince Edward County found a way to get an education. A friend of mine, James G., came to Iowa, was sent to Iowa, a place he'd never been before, to go to school, finish high school in Iowa, then finished college in Iowa, then came back to Virginia in time to be admitted to the University of Virginia Law School and became a lawyer. So there were some good things that happened out of that too, but the efforts of private groups like the Society of Friends just weren't sufficient. Couldn't do anything against the power of the state, which was determined to keep these schools segregated. Yes, sir.
I've been very influenced by Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which in essence says a war on drugs is a war on black males. And I'm convinced that the war on drugs is effected a new discrimination and a new Jim Crow equivalent in many ways in its effect and impact to the Jim Crow of the 30s and through the 50s. Do you have any thoughts on the war on drugs and its disparate impact on black community, particularly black males?
I think she's absolutely right in the description of what had happened and in blaming the war on drugs as one of the pillars of destruction in black communities. But I think you also ought to read a counter-argument made by James Forman, who's a Yale law graduate, and now at Yale, I think. Isn't he at Yale now? Who's had a counter-argument to Michelle Alexander, and I won't tell you which one is the best one, hers or his, but it'd be interesting to read his counter-argument to hers.
What's the book? James Forman.
James Forman. Yeah, I don't know the name of it, but it's a counter-argument to Alexander. Yes, sir.
Could you speak a bit about voter ID and the assault on the Voting Rights Act and the new poll tax and where
It's incredible because it's almost nothing but bad news. It's amazing because, you know, there's no such thing, as far as we can tell, of voter fraud in America. But yet, the Republicans have convinced people, and I just saw a study yesterday, that when you show a black person voting, voters are more willing to engage in voter ID plans because they associate black people with cheating in politics. And it's just so irritating that having won all these fights, made all these sacrifices, died so often, that now we've got to do it all over again. And just awful, these voter ID things, just, ooh, it just makes my blood boil. But their only purpose is to keep racial minorities, the elderly, and people who have no access to identifications, to keep them from voting. That's all it is. And if you look hard enough, you can go through the literature and see Republicans saying we did it for this reason because too many minorities were voting, we didn't want them to vote and so on. Just admitting what they did and why they did it. They're shameless. They have no shame. Disgraceful. Awful. Terrible. Yes, sir.
Since our neighborhoods are increasingly getting more and more segregated, and our schools are based on zones on those neighborhoods, if we were to abolish zoning and bring in school choice, could that solve a measure of the segregated school problem?
I think it would solve a measure of it, surely, yes. Yeah. But I think you need something more. And what we all need is some commitment to us that we want to have segregated, rather integrated education. We want our children to go to school with children who are not like them. We want them to have a real chance to meet new people. And unless we make a common commitment to that, I don't think any mechanics with the zones and so on is really going to make much happen. But it's a good idea. Yes, yes.
Do you see any dangers of seeking to have the law promote a colorblind society?
I'm sorry?
Of using the law to promote a colorblind society? Like, what are some of the dangers you see in the future of using?
Well, I said humorously, I'm afraid the Supreme Court will say that we're now a colorblind society because they say it is. And because they say it is, which is nonsensical. But much of what they do is nonsensical to begin with. So I don't think if you just say something is something, that it is something. And that's what this argument is, that we see the election of our first black president, and we believe that that has created a colorblind America, and that all racial problems have disappeared and gone away because of this fact. And of course, I think most people know that's just not true. Sadly, some people believe it is true, but it's not true, and it will not be true anytime soon.
My mother's a member of the civil rights generation, and she has consistently criticized my own generation for not marching. And that's true. We haven't marched as much. So what do you suggest this generation do?
Well, I don't think you ought to measure your relevance by the miles that you march. I don't think that's not the standard. That's not the standard I'm judging people by. I think to the degree that you're engaged somehow or the other in fights for social justice, that's the standard by which your participation should be judged. I never liked to march, and although I did march sometimes in some places, I didn't measure my own participation by the miles I marched, and I don't think we ought to do that today. So, you know, there's a ugly thing happened in what's the name of that town? In Ferguson, Missouri, last week. NAACP president was booed by young people there. And he had given, if you believe the New York Times, he had given a fiery speech, a wonderful speech. And young people turned their backs on him. And I wondered, what the hell's wrong with you young people? When are you going to do something good? In fact, young people are marching. Young people are protesting. You can see it all around the country in response to these murders, these police murders that go on. So I think it's a wrong critique, but I don't think it ought to be march only. Yes.
Yes, sir. I was wondering if you have had the opportunity to observe the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina with Reverend Julian Bond and the work that they're doing there, and what your thoughts were about that.
I was in North Carolina on Saturday speaking with Reverend Barber at the state conference of the NAACP. It had about 1,000 people gathered at a big rally. Wonderful, wonderful turnout of people. This moral majority, moral movement is just a fabulous thing. And, you know, we ought to realize that it is taken up in other states as well. They do it in Georgia and 2 or 3 other states at least, and I'm sure they're going to do it in more.
Well, we had our first rally here in Indiana 3 weeks ago, and Reverend Barber came to that rally and helped us have a march from Christmas Annex High School to the State House. And it's NAACP led here
in Indiana. So we're one of the states that he's supporting. And he's from Indianapolis as a baby and then went on to North Carolina.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. But he's a pistol, isn't he? Yeah, yeah. And what he's done, I think more people are doing it. I'm glad to hear about it being done here, but more people are copying what he's done, and it's going to spread and spread and spread and spread. Have one or two more? Yes, sir.
Is there, you talk about race and class as the determinants at one point of the weakness of the education system. What can we do about class, about having super rich people, super poor people, few in between, but I think we all need to get in the middle together. Do you have any suggestions on that?
Not really. This is a tough one. I can't think. How do you eliminate class divides? That's a tough question. I'm not sure I have the answer to it, but it is one of the problems that we face. These growing wealth and growing poverty, just frightening divisions around in our country that seem to be getting larger and larger and larger and larger. And I wish I could say do this, do that, and the other thing, and it'll be all right, but I can't. Yes.
I recently read an article about the effects of charter schools on public education, and that article was looking at the fact that charter schools are becoming a way to create more segregation. So I wanted to hear maybe your views on charter schools, and if you think that is true, or if they can be used for more positive ways.
You know, charter schools range from here to here, and here are some wonderful, wonderful schools that do a fabulous, fabulous job at teaching young people, and over here are some that do nothing at all, and are really just attempts to make money by somebody. One thing is curious to me, and I'm not sure what the answer to this, as I'm not sure the answer to so many things, is that why wealthy people are so enamored of charter schools. What's going on here? Something bad is happening, I'm sure. I mean, just think about it, something bad is happening. So if you think of a charter school going from here to here are the great ones, here are the awful ones. The idea of charter schools was once these charter schools were begun, they would commit a competition with the public schools, and public schools say, oh, we're going to get better now because these people take, well, that hasn't happened. That's not going to happen. It's silly to think it would. So charter schools have their place, I think, in the American education arena. But so far, the fact that some of them are so good and some of them are so bad points out to me that the bad ones need to be done away with as quickly as we can. I don't know if that will happen or not. But you have one more. Okay.
Please. I thank you for your comments regarding Michelle Alexander's work and the kind of argument. I'm familiar with it as well, but in my opinion, I think she has better arguments. That's my opinion. In light of that, I wonder if you can speak a little bit about, or at least offer some opinions about the school-to-prison pipeline, as that has a lot to do with poverty, particularly the way it affects.
Well, it's true that there is a school-to-prison pipeline. I mean, you hear that, and I don't know if this is true myself, you hear that in some places in the country, people are deciding how many schools they need to build and how many prisons they need to build, because that'll show them how many, if they figure out how many schools they're going to build and how many children will be needed for them, then they'll know how many prisons are gone, because they're going to have a place to put these kids, because they're not going to go to school very long. And that's frightening if that's so. So it's pretty sure, I think, that there is a school-to-prison pipeline, and there large numbers of black young people are finding their way into prison, not because they're criminally, not because they're criminally minded, but because their circumstances, their homes, their families, the neighborhoods in which they live breed criminality. And so it's a sure thing that this is happening, and we need to do something badly about it as much as we can. Ooh, Thank you all very much.